want to bring into the conversation now Sherrilyn Ifill. She's president and director counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Sherrilyn, it's great to have you here. Thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you about the privilege claims here. One of the things that's been interesting over the course of these proceedings is that we, the public, keep getting new information. Stuff from FOIA lawsuits that's being released, heavily redacted materials and lots of privilege claims, deliberative privilege claims from the White House in terms of what we're allowed to see. Chris Hayes earlier tonight was describing that as a sort of battleground here, part of one of the core issues that we're having conflict about in terms of what we know about the president's behavior.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, the concept of privilege is a core one and a critical one. My fear is that it's being used in ways in which it was never meant to be used. It's being used as a blanket way of simply saying anyone who's ever been in a room with me can't talk to you. And my fear is it's distorting the whole concept of privilege. And the use of it, I would actually call it the abuse of privilege, should be concerning. And when I look out and I watch these arguments and I see all the lawyers, all the senators who are lawyers, in that room and who really know what privilege is and who know what the limitations of privilege are, but who are willing to go along with these arguments that in any other context they would recognize as specious, it's deeply concerning.
Is this the sort of thing, though, where we're going to ultimately have a fight over whether these privilege claims are proper and they'll be adjudicated and somebody will say, I'm going to force this and I'm going to make the courts weigh in on this and we're going to force these materials out. And then in, 2029, somewhere down the road, somebody, people who are the next generation of cable TV people will be talking about those court rulings and they won't be able to remember what they were about. I mean, these things take forever, right?
But what worries me is that we tend to think that we're going to be around in 2029 having this kind of conversation. And I think it'll be a very different country in 2029 if we don't begin to address, particularly as it relates to the rule of law, some of the excesses that we have seen over the last few years. That's what's supposed to be the thing that holds us from one administration to another, from one year to another, from one generation to another as a country. And the kind of topsy-turvy approach to the rule of law and the willingness of so many in our profession to acquiesce to these excesses, I think suggests that we may be on a road to this being a very different country. And so when we get to this place that we think we're going to get to, where this is all going to be, washed out, it may not matter because we just may be in a very different place as a republic.
But we may be right now pretty much exactly 1 year away from every single document that's in contention now being released immediately to the Congress, which, if there's a new president sworn in on Inauguration Day next year, that afternoon, all of this will happen. The president's tax returns will immediately be sent from the IRS to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Those senators and House members, but especially these senators, should know that they are now possibly 1 year away from the full release of every single document that's in contention here, and their votes will be measured against that information when it comes out a year from now.
But the chance they're taking, the presumption is that it's not going to be a different president. And they're taking that chance, I think, in some measure because of what we see today. I think some people are forgetting that this actually is about the integrity of the 2020 election. It's about what the claim is that the president tried to do with regard to the 2020 election. And even as we sit here and as we watch this impeachment, there's legislation like the SHIELD Act, which was sponsored by Zoe Lofgren, that's designed to prevent some of the things that happened in 2016 from happening again, preventing foreign governments from being able to get campaign information, disclosures of foreign governments and political advertisements and so forth. And all of those bills, they're about 10 bills, and they're sitting in the Senate. And Senate leadership will not allow those bills to move that are designed to protect our election. So the chance some people are taking is that they won't have to worry about what happens in January of next year. And it's important, especially for someone like me who's involved in, working on voter suppression, and for the communities of people that I represent, when we watch this, that we're not just talking about the personal political fate of President Trump or any of the senators in the room. We're talking about the integrity of our elections. People may come out in droves, but if our elections are not protected, if they can be hacked, if foreign governments can do the same kind of thing that was done in the past, if the president actually can call for foreign governments to do what he did with impunity, these are all issues that go to the very heart of our democracy. And for the people that I represent who struggled for decades and centuries to have the ability to be full citizens and participate in the political process, we all of the political talk, what undergirds it is that is our ability to participate as full citizens. And that's what makes us a democracy. And ultimately, that's what this is all about. And we just can't lose sight of that.
I think Adam Schiff going so far, and what appeared to be an ad lib today, to call these proceedings as being about the president cheating in the next election, using that phrase cheating, that he was trying essentially to rig the next election and interfere with it and cheat. That's going to be on the front page of a number of newspapers nationwide tomorrow. And I think he went out on a rhetorical limb, maybe further than he had planned to, but by being so aggressive on that point, I do think, at least for today, put that squarely at the center of the narrative.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.